You are watching The World 24/7 on the NDTV network. I'm Parmeshwar Bawa. Let's begin with the top stories you need to know. At least 5 people have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on a medical facility said to be linked to Hezbollah in central Beirut. Israel, meanwhile, has continued its push into Lebanon with multiple clashes reported between Hezbollah and the Israel Defense Forces. And according to a report, Iran's Supreme Leader, Mr. Khamenei, warned Hezbollah leader Nasrallah to flee Lebanon just days before he was killed in an Israeli strike. In response to Iran's missile strike on Israel, the United States and G7 are contemplating new sanctions. US President Joe Biden discussed the situation with the G7 leaders. As tensions soared across West Asia after Iran's missile barrage on Israel, which threatened retaliation, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has met US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Washington, D.C. And India, while calling for restraint by all concerned and protection of civilians, advised all its nationals to avoid all non-essential travel to Iran. Israel's foreign minister has said that he was barring UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres from entering the country because he had not unequivocally condemned Iran's missile attack on Israel. A US bomb, likely dropped during World War II, exploded near the runway at Miyazaki Airport in southwest Japan, forcing its closure. The blast created a 7-meter wide and 1-meter deep crater on the taxiway, prompting authorities to shut down the runway. About 87 flights have been cancelled. The startup behind ChatGPT, which is reportedly planning to become a for-profit business, is now valued on par with Uber. OpenAI has raised $6.6 billion in a funding round that values the artificial intelligence business at $157 billion, with chipmaker NVIDIA and Japanese group SoftBank among its investors. Toyota invested another $500 million into a US air taxi firm, California-based Joby Aviation, which plans to build electric vehicles, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft capable of carrying 4 passengers for short intercity journeys, and hopes to have a commercial service running next year. Well, a big focus, Israeli airstrikes are still being reported across Beirut, and the Lebanese Health Ministry says at least 6 people have been killed and 7 injured in an Israeli attack on a health center in the central suburb of Bajora. Now, you must remember it is a war crime to target health workers. But the Gulf Cooperation Council, meanwhile, has reiterated its support for Lebanon and also called for the implementation of a 2006 UN resolution that calls for Lebanese troops and UN peacekeepers to be the only armed forces south of Lebanon's Litani River. The Council, which is made up of countries including Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, urged the international community to fulfill its responsibilities in order to maintain security as well as stability in the region. The losses, though, were the deadliest suffered by the Israeli military on the Lebanon front in the past year of clashes between Israel and its Iran-backed Lebanese adversary. But the Israeli military says regular infantry and armored units were joining its ground operations in Lebanon just a day after Israel was attacked by Iran in a missile strike that raised concerns that the oil-producing Middle East could be caught in a wider conflict. And according to a report, by the way, Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, warned Hezbollah leader Nasrallah to flee Lebanon just days before he was killed in an Israeli strike. My colleague Trent Murray joins us from Tel Aviv with the latest updates.
Well, we are hearing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been meeting with cabinet ministers as well as senior military and intelligence officials, charting a course on how to respond to the Iranian ballistic missile attack. Now, the IDF has confirmed that 181 of those missiles were fired at the state of Israel. Most of them were largely intercepted by the air defense system, as well as 2 US warships which are currently parked off the coast. But we have had an admission from the IDF that some of those missiles did manage to make it through and hit several Air Force bases. Now, they are insisting that no aircraft were damaged or military facilities, but they are saying that some office buildings and maintenance facilities did take a hit. Now, we know that there are several options being discussed reportedly by the Israelis. Media here is suggesting that all options are on the table, but one that is being closely looked at is Israel targeting critical infrastructure inside of Iran, including oil and gas facilities. Now, the thinking reportedly goes from inside that decision-making circle is that hitting those facilities could really hurt the Iranian economy, just given how reliant they are on those fossil fuels amid their sanction-strapped economy. We know amongst all of this, close conversations are taking place between Israel and the United States. I think Israel is acutely aware that any sort of response of that magnitude could spiral the entire West Asia region into a war, which is why they are trying to keep the US very close in all of this. But we have to remember that Iran has said that any sort of response from Israel will garner yet another retaliation larger than the one that they saw earlier in the week. In Tel Aviv, I'm Trent Murray, NDTV.
Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden spoke with G7 leaders to discuss Iran's unacceptable actions and coordinate a response which may include new sanctions. But Joe Biden said that Iran is way off course, but confirmed that he does not support an attack on Iran's nuclear sites. In fact, Biden added that he would be speaking with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu very soon. Listen in to what the US President had to say.
We'll be discussing with the Israelis what they're going to do, but all 7 of us agree that they have a right to respond.
And for further clarity, we have with us political analyst and chief editor of Mehr News Agency, Payman Yazdani, joining us. Thank you so much, Mr. Yazdani, for making time for us. At this point, it's undeniable at this stage that Israel is poised to retaliate against Iran for Tuesday's volley of ballistic missiles. But would you say once Iran directly entered the fray, America's tone and strategy changed, and so have Israel's?
Last night, finally, Iran targeted Israel with hundreds of missiles because of 3 reasons. As you know, a couple of months ago, contrary to all international norms and regulations, Israel assassinated Iran's guest Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and violated Iran's sovereignty. And the second, last week, they assassinated Iran's closest ally in the region, Said Hassan Nasrallah, and also in a cyber terrorist attack, they once again wounded another Iranian diplomat in Beirut, I mean the Iranian ambassador to Beirut, against all international norms, and also assassinated Iranian advisory top military man in the country. All these were the reasons that Iran once again decided to punish Israel. And yes, it can be interpreted as Iran's support to Hezbollah, to Palestinian people, and also defending its nationals and sovereignty.
In your view, how is the conflict impacting Iran's relationship, meanwhile, with other countries in the region, particularly those that have recently normalized relations with Israel?
The effect of this attack on Iran relation and its neighboring countries that have normalized ties with the Israeli regime, it is noteworthy that despite Iran has criticized the countries in the region who have normalized their ties with Israel, but at the same time, Iran believes and have announced that as far as their lands and their soils are not used against Iran's national interest, there is no problem in the relation with those countries. Not only there is no problem, but also Iran has announced, especially the Iran's new government has announced that boosting relations with neighbors is on top agenda of Iran's foreign policy. And today Iranian president left Tehran to Doha and during his visit to Doha, several agreements will be signed between Iran and Qatar.
But then do you see United States going after Iran and imposing more sanctions, as we're hearing as per reports, and prevent it from taking on Israel?
Yes, I'm sure. The United States and its close allies will find some new excuses to impose sanctions against Iran after Iran attack on Israel. They are addicted to that. This is the history shows this, and Iranian officials have announced this. And Iranian nation and governments are used to these kind of hypocritical acts.
Well, there remains the danger that wider wars, once begun, take years to put back in the box, and the presence of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and an instinct to escalate creates a particularly toxic brew. But thank you so much, Mr. Yazdani, for joining us with your perspective. Meanwhile, Israel's foreign minister has declared United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres persona non grata and barred him from entering the country. Israel's foreign minister, Mr. Katz, accused Guterres of failing to unequivocally condemn Iran's missile attack on Israel, and Israel has persistently complained over the UN's approach throughout its year-long war in Gaza. Meanwhile, what kinds of weapons did Iran use to strike Israel on Tuesday night? Iran does have an arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles and drones, which have been used in the recent past to target Israel. It's believed, as we have been reporting, that nearly 200 ballistic missiles were fired by Iran on Tuesday night. But let's just focus on that for a moment with Vishnu Shom.
Well, what weapons did Iran use to strike Israel last night? Iran has an arsenal of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and drones, which have been used in the recent past to target Israel. It's believed that nearly 200 ballistic missiles were fired by Iran. Let's focus on that for a moment. Now, Iran operates, for starters, a 300-kilometer range missile called the Shadab-1. Now, that's a relatively short-range missile. It cannot hit Israel. It can only strike targets in this region, well away from Israel, which is over here. Now, another missile is the Fateh missile that flies between 300 and 500 kilometers. Again, that missile doesn't have the range to hit Israel. Another missile is the Shadab-2. It's got longer legs, 500 kilometers, still out of range of targets in Israel. We've got an image of that missile up on the screen as well. As you can see, every missile I'm describing, we've got an actual image of. The Zolfaghar missile can just about touch Israel. It's got a range of 700 kilometers. So parts of Israel just about can be targeted by this missile. There is a missile called the Qiyam-1, which has a range of 50 kilometers more, 750 kilometers. That's what it looks like. It's relatively more advanced, can strike a few more targets in Israel, but not deep inside Israel. But there is the Shahed-3 with a range of 2,000 kilometers, which can quite easily strike all of Israel. In fact, it can strike many other areas in the region. So that's a missile, variants of which may actually have been used. But Israel, for its part, has the world's most sophisticated ballistic missile defense system. It's a tiered defense system. It's a system that was clearly breached last night. Now, we saw video of Iranian missiles hit Tel Aviv. These were some of the launches which actually took place of those ballistic missiles from Iran and making contact with targets in parts of Tel Aviv. Now, Israel does have that ballistic missile defense system. What we don't know is how many of these missiles hit their targets and whether some of the impacts were of fragments of the missiles coming down after they were intercepted by the Israeli missile shield. While we do talk about surface-to-air missiles being fired by Israel in defense, we really do need to take a look at the distance that these surface-to-air missile interceptors travel and the altitude or height to which they can fly to take out threats like the ones that you're seeing on your screen, which are the Iranian ballistic missiles which were fired. So for starters, let's talk a little bit about Israel's Arrow system. Now that's the missile. It's part of a system, so we use the word missile and system interchangeably. Now when one talks about surface-to-air missile systems, you have to talk about the range of the missile, and you also have to talk about the altitude to which it flies. So the Arrow system can intercept incoming ballistic missiles in the exoatmosphere as well, or just outside the atmosphere. It has a range of 2,000 kilometers, 2,400 kilometers in fact, and it can fly to an altitude of a whopping 100 kilometers. It's perhaps the most advanced system of its class in the world. So that's part one. It was used yesterday, but there were other systems presumably which were also used to make a large number of the interceptions. So let's look at the next one, which is the David Sling. Now that's the missile. The missile, it's called the Nammer. It's part of the David Sling system. That can fly to a range of 300 kilometers and an altitude of about 15 odd kilometers in making interceptions. And finally, what we all talk about is the Iron Dome. Now that's the Iron Dome system. It's a relatively short-range missile system. In fact, when one speaks about what Israel has, people say that it's Israel's Iron Dome in action. In fact, Iron Dome is part of that missile defense system that I've been describing. It's the last line of defense. It can fly to an altitude of 10 kilometers, and it has a range of about 70 kilometers. It can travel to a distance of about 70 kilometers. But it is that last line of defense. It's not optimally suited to take out ballistic missiles. It's better equipped to take on rockets, short-range rockets of the type that Hamas and Hezbollah have been firing. So that's what Israel has been using to defend itself. Obviously, there have been breaches of the system as well, but it appears that not many lives have been lost. One person is thought to have lost their lives, and the damage primarily is believed to be on Israeli military bases. The big question, will there be an Israeli response, and when will that happen?
Well, as you've learned, Iran's attack on Israel wasn't just a barrage of missiles. It was a barrage of 181 ballistic missiles, each having a warhead payload of between 700 to 1,000 kilograms, which can destroy entire buildings. This is unprecedented in the history of our warfare. This is what the Israel ambassador to India has said to NDTV. Listen in to this exclusive interview.
The war in West Asia now is at a critical juncture. We're joined by a very special guest, Reuven Azar, the Israeli envoy to New Delhi. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you, Vishnu.
It does seem that despite the intensity of the attacks by Iran last night, they were calibrated in the sense that populated areas of Tel Aviv were not struck, fortunately. Does that imply that Israel's response, when it does come, will also be calibrated?
I wouldn't imply that, Vishnu, and that's the result of the attack. By the way, it wasn't just a barrage of missiles; it's a barrage of 181 ballistic missiles, with each one with a payload between 700 to 1,000 kilograms that is capable of destroying an entire building. Okay, this is unprecedented in the history of warfare. Fortunately, because of the fact that we have the best defense system in the world, we have managed to thwart it, and the only missiles that have actually hit were the ones that hit in open areas, right, because usually we do not target those, okay? So this is a very serious situation, and this is not the first time this is coming from Iran. Now, the Iranians, well, actually, it's not the Iranian people. We don't have nothing against them. It's this regime, this radical regime, has been trying every possible way to destroy the state of Israel. They have stated publicly that they want to destroy the state of Israel. They've been financing for the last 30 years all these terrorist groups with billions and billions of dollars on the account of their own, taking this money from their own people. Mm-hmm. And they are failing. We are determined to defend ourselves. We are not going to allow this regime to threaten the state of Israel.
Ambassador, what was the damage last night?
Well, I'm just quoting the spokesperson of the IDF. The IDF doesn't give wrong information.
Right.
The right information is that, fortunately, we haven't seen damage out of this barrage because we have defended ourselves against it. Unfortunately, there was a tragic loss of life of a Palestinian from a Gaza origin that has been hit by a missile in the Jericho area, and he lost his life, unfortunately. He was murdered by this missile. Besides that, we didn't see any major damage caused.
Meanwhile, Israelis were photographed taking photos and climbing on the remains of an Iranian missile that was intercepted by Israel. Iran launched at least 180 missiles, as we've been saying, into Israel, the latest in a series of rapidly escalating attacks between Israel and Iran and its Arab allies that threatens to push the Middle East closer to a region-wide war. Well, let's turn our attention now to Japan, where an unexploded US bomb from World War II that had been buried at a Japanese airport exploded, causing a large crater in a taxiway and the cancellation of more than 80 flights, but no injuries, fortunately. Officials say an investigation by the self-defense forces and police confirmed that the explosion was caused by a 500-pound US bomb and that there was no further danger. But by the way, hundreds of tons of unexploded bombs from the war remain buried around Japan and are sometimes dug up at construction sites as well. Well, news and updates continue in a moment, right after this very short break. Don't go anywhere. OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, has raised $6.6 billion in its latest funding round, as investors, including its early backer Microsoft, continue to bet big on artificial intelligence. The deal gave the tech company a value of $157 billion, similar to investment bank Goldman Sachs and more than most of America's biggest companies, making it one of the most valuable startups in the world. The influx comes as the company has been in the spotlight, in part for internal leadership drama and debate over its future status. In other news, Toyota invested another $500 million into a US air taxi firm. A California-based company plans to build electrical vertical takeoff and landing aircraft capable of carrying 4 passengers for short intercity journeys and hopes to have a commercial service running next year. In fact, Toyota invested another $500 million into this California-based company. They say that they are hopeful to start commercial services in 2025. Well, thank you for investing your time and watching this edition of The World 24/7. We'll keep tracking the latest updates for you. Do stay tuned.